Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It is Monday, March 30th, 2026, and I'd like to talk about a topic which may be somewhat unsettling for people, but I feel like it's been affecting me personally, and it's affecting everybody, I think, at this point. So I want to identify this issue. I'm calling it open society or Orwellian society. So I'm going to go through a kind of a series of events that I see that have been happening over the course of a number of years that are resulting in a society which is becoming more and more in a kind of a lockdown mode. That's what it looks like to me. And I think, I grew up during the 1950s and 1960s, and that was a time when things seemed to be quite open, and it was a time when comedians could use foul language, and the courts would, they'd be sent to jail, and then the Supreme Court would say, no, that's his free speech rights. Well, now we've reached the point where the court you can actually get thrown into jail for speaking just flat out truth. So that's how far we've come. But anyway, I'm going to start off with, there was certainly during the 1950s, there was the McCarthy era, late 40s, 1950s, the McCarthy era, where people were accused of being communist if they harbored, any kind of views left of Genghis Khan. Then the 1960s, the beatniks and the hippies and the anti-war movements were ways of pushing back against that. And also there was a tremendous freedom of movement, especially if you had a U.S. passport, you could go pretty much anywhere you wanted, and everybody was very, well, I would say, they wanted your money, I guess you could say. They're happy to see you on that basis. So it was very easy to travel, but it's becoming more difficult now, and there's issues coming up. So I'm going to start off with the September 11th attacks, because during the 1990s, things were looking pretty good. The Cold War was over, and it looked like things were getting better. On the other hand, Bill Clinton had signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, into act, which was supposed to improve free trade. Didn't really help at all, actually. But things on the surface, things seemed to be okay. Because the evil Soviet Union had collapsed. That was the main issue. And there was even talk, as my friend John Rachel has discussed with my friend Regis Tremblay, a peace dividend. Well, September 11th, 2001, basically squashed that. So on September 11th, you had, I guess it was supposedly four jet planes. Two of them flew into each of the two World Trade Center towers, and they collapsed on themselves and fell down, which is the first time that an airplane flying into a building has resulted in that kind of situation. And coincidentally, the guy who had just taken out a lease on those buildings, Larry Silverstein, and used to have his breakfast on the top floor of one of the World Trade Center towers, had a dentist appointment or something like that. He couldn't show up for work that day, but he does have a friend named Bibi Netanyahu. So, and he had also taken out a terrorist insurance policy, so that if in the odd event that something would happen to the World Trade Center buildings, he would get paid, several $1 billion. But the upshot of it for us, for you and me, was something where there was something called the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act was a way to counteract the danger of international terrorism, presumably. And as a result, there were a number of provisions of it. Now, I was in the financial service business at that time. I was selling life and health insurance to people. And you'd think, okay, fine, somebody wants an insurance policy or needs some health insurance, fine, I can do that. And I could also sell mutual funds to people if they wanted to, do some long-term investing in that way. But in any case, the one of the provisions that came out with this Patriot Act was that something called the Suspicious Activities Report. And that said that if I had a customer who was moving money around in ways that looked kind of unusual or strange, that I needed to file a suspicious activity report on my client without telling him that I was doing that. And if I didn't do that, I would be breaking the law. So to me, that seemed like basically the government was telling me that I have to. They were creating the legal basis for me to spy on my own, surveil my own clients. And I really didn't feel good about that. And sure enough, a couple of years later, several years later, I decided just to get out of that business completely because there was that aspect of it, not to mention the fact that in the dot-com crash had occurred and the whole Wall Street situation seemed like a rigged game. And I just thought, this is something, I can't do this anymore. So I left it. But anyway, that was a major shift in the public consciousness. Another major shift occurred when another aspect of this was the Department of Homeland Security. And that had never existed before. And George W. Bush, decided to create a new cabinet position called the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security resulted in the TSA, the Transportation Safety Authority, whatever it's called, where it became a lot more difficult to even get on an airplane. They made special rules for, you have to take your shoes off and all these kinds of things. So it was making it more difficult for people to travel. So there was that aspect of it. And then you had the 2008 financial crash, and people lost. I actually met a woman on an airplane, and her son. Just to give you an example of this is a case study. So I'm on an airplane. I was flying from the United States to Thailand, and this woman is sitting next to me. And what's your story? She says, well, my son, we lost both our houses in the financial crash, the house where we lived in and a rental house. We lost them both. And now we're going to Thailand, where I come from, because my son is going to go into the Marines. And I just thought, they've created a poverty draft. They took 2 houses away from this woman, and now they're going to take their son. Not a good situation. I think I said something. She was not happy about it. I'm quite sure, but I didn't want to, it's not my place to say anything about it. So that was in 2008. And then in 2011, in response to all these problems, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement. And people were rising up and saying, Wall Street is rigged and we're getting screwed and we're tired of it. And so there were encampments all over the country. However, in one weekend, one night particularly, but over a weekend, Barack Obama, the Democratic Hope and Change president, had the Homeland Security Organization, the Homeland Security Agency, which had been created in the wake of 9/11, to go in and crush Occupy Wall Street, crush a people's movement for change, for reform of the financial system. So you have that aspect of it. So that was in 2011. Then you had there are other things going on. You had a number of countries. Libya was destroyed in that year 2011. Honduras had been invaded. That was Hillary Clinton going in and staging a coup against a democratically elected president of that country. You had the Syrian war, civil war being created, again using some of the most violent extremists that they could find following the Iraq War of 2003. So you've got this sequence of events where things are kind of heating up. Then in 2014, the United States, under President Obama, and with Joe Biden as his lieutenant, the vice president at the time, overseeing a coup against the democratically elected government of Ukraine. And that government that regime, which is at the core of the war that's been ongoing since 2014, basically they weaponized these descendants of people who had collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. And if you didn't like that, you would get sanctioned. So Russia was being put under sanctions for objecting to it, and of course, people in eastern Ukraine were being subjected to shelling and bombing and things like that. And as a result, they broke away and created separate republics, which were not recognized by the world at all. I think most of the world still doesn't recognize them. Russia did finally in 2022 realize that an incipient massacre and an ethnic cleansing campaign was about to take place, and they preempted that with their attack in 2022 in what is called the Special Military Operation. If Russia had decided to wage war against Ukraine, they could have done a shock and awe type of thing, which is when the United States went into Iraq and bombed the complete crap out of the buildings, the infrastructure, the water, the electricity. Everything was destroyed. That's the way the U.S. wages war. The Russians didn't want to do that, but they got massive sanctions on them. So at that point, it became more difficult to even travel in Russia. No, it's not illegal to go to Russia. It's illegal to go to Cuba, I believe. When I thought we had freedom to travel. Well, we do, but and North Korea. Well, we do have a freedom to travel, but there's some countries that are not on the approved list. So that's an encroachment on the First Amendment as well. Anyway, what happened was the Russian banking system was sanctioned, so that if you wanted to use a U.S. credit card inside of Russia or U.S. debit card, something like that, you couldn't do it. You couldn't move money into Russia. If you wanted to travel there, you couldn't do that. And likewise, if you were Russian, if you had a Russian card, it became more difficult to travel outside of Russia. So, people would basically have to carry cash back and forth in order to do that. But it was just another example of this kind of slowly squeezing. So we're taking that up to 2022. And then again, there had been Russian TV stations, the Russia Today, and which is now called RT. And you also had I think it's mostly a radio station or a news website called Sputnik. And there were a lot of Americans who were American journalists who were on RT and on Sputnik. And one of the main things that distinguished them was the fact that these stations exerted no editorial control over what they wrote and talked about. Whereas some of these people, one of them, I think, Rick Sanchez is an example. He he used to work for some of the major networks, and he said, if he wanted to talk about something, he had to run it past the editor to make sure that the station approved it. Whereas the Russian stations, they didn't do that. Now you could say that the people who chose to be on the Russian stations, there was a reason for that, because they didn't, they were a counter narrative to the U.S. narrative. So they would probably be given more of a latitude to talk, more latitude than they would be given to talk on a U.S. Station. So there's that. And then let's see. Now the other thing that's been happening is that in the banking situation is becoming more complicated. So, for example, I'm retired. I live in Thailand, and I have a Thai bank account, which has been perfectly okay to open. But now I understand that the Thai government is making it a little more difficult for people to open a bank account. And on the other hand, I have U.S. bank accounts, and in order to use the U.S. bank account, it's helpful to get into the U.S. bank's website. However, they have something called 2FA authorization, which means that it's not enough to just put in your username and password. You also have to have an extra layer of identification to allow you to use the website. And for some reason, the methods that I try to use don't work. So I'm not able to access my bank accounts. And that's a kind of a problem. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But here's the point: is that there's this kind of ongoing constriction going on, and so I talk about this from the point of view of open society, and George Soros is a famous billionaire who advocates what is called open society. But what George Soros meant by open society was that there's two kinds of societies. One which is allow capital to move into a country and basically do whatever they want to do. And that often means buying stuff, on the cheap. So, for example, after the Soviet Union fell, George Soros type people said, now that the Soviet Union has fallen, your financial system is open. You've got an open society. Now we can, it's okay for us to, operate inside of Russia. So, but what they did was they organized the situation so that many of the industries and factories and things of that nature lost a tremendous amount of value. And so these billionaires came in and scooped up Russian assets at pennies on the dollar. And this happened, I think, also throughout Eastern Europe. So this is an example of where the idea of open society is used in order to basically exploit countries using international capital. But and one of the ways that they do that is with non-governmental organizations. So you'll have a non-governmental organization inside of a country, and they'll spread basically dissension within that country. All countries have difficulties, and so if you have a external money coming in from a foreign country to finance people who are objecting to various policies in that country, then it can cause problems, serious problems. So maybe one of the most egregious examples of that was in Hong Kong, where Hong Kong was it's a separate. It is part of China, but it is governed separately from the Beijing government. At least it has been. But these non-governmental organizations stirred up a lot of trouble. They were ultimately causing riots, and eventually the Beijing government realized that this was out of control, and they squashed it, and they said, you can't do that. Now, America calls itself an open society, but if you are a foreign country and you try to finance a U.S. election, that's completely illegal. So it's okay for our open society, quote unquote, to go into another country and subvert their elections, but it's not okay for other countries to have a say in our elections by financing candidates that would be more acceptable to their interests, and perhaps even to the interests of the American people. If you're, can you imagine financing Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, or Jill Stein, the of the Green Party? Both of those opposed U.S. foreign policy to some degree, and of course, the whole controversy about Russia interfering in the elections was a huge issue for a number of years, even though it turns out that, in fact, Russia had almost nothing to do with financing anything inside the U.S. elections. So they used that. And yet, in 1996, there was a Time magazine cover saying that the United States saved Russia by propping up Boris Yeltsin, the hated president of Russia at that time, who had sold his country to foreign corporations. And in the United States, he had like a 3% approval rating, and somehow with a couple of $1 billion coming in, he wins the election. So this is the double standard that is taking place here. That the whole idea of open society is basically it's a Trojan horse, in effect, to control other countries. And at the same time, they're trying to convince the American people that we have an open society, when in fact we do not, because there is censorship. Russia Today, or RT, was kicked off of cable news networks, and the people who were working for RT, in most cases, were threatened to stop working for them or face legal action. So this is again an example of how we claim to be an open society, but in fact we're really not. And also it applies to the banking system. So, for example, there's one website, Consortium News, which has been in existence, I think, since the 1990s. They were exposing things like the Iran-Contra affair. Robert Perry was an excellent, investigative journalist. And so Consortium News has been, doing its work for a number of decades at this point. And at one point, PayPal said, we're shutting down your account and we're not giving you the $8,000 that you have in there. This is called open society. So, and there have been other cases where journalists have been on YouTube or on Facebook, and YouTube and Facebook say, you're not on our platform anymore, and all the content that you created, it's gone. So they basically, destroyed the work of an independent person. So this is an example of where open society is not really an open society. And so I think I will I'll end it here. I've had other experiences where I'm coming into contact with this kind of situation, and it looks to me what I sense here is that as the U.S. Political system and its whole system of hegemony and so on worldwide is losing control, it is becoming, the political class is becoming emotionally more tense. And when you're tense, your body, tenses up, and you develop something, what we call body armor, where the muscles tense up, and it's difficult for new ideas to come in. And the open society is so people are being locked down inside their own minds, and this is the ultimate objective of this whole situation. and it's very dangerous. And essentially, what it's doing is it's inculcating a kind of slow motion move towards totalitarianism, where free speech is no longer allowed, free movement of money is no longer allowed, and there are consequences if you run afoul of the system. So as we saw, in the case of the ICE protests. Now, whether the No Kings movement can counteract some of that is, it's a good question. However, I understand that the No Kings movement was financed in part, at least, by George Soros. So what's the motive there? The motive is probably that there's much deeper issues about the way U.S. Politics works, and they want to keep that confined inside a narrative where people will not question outside of that narrative. So that's the issue, and it's manifesting in all these different ways. So that's what I want to talk about, and I hope that I'm shedding some light on some of these issues so that you can give it some thought and realize that in 2001, I think, after the 9/11 attacks, I had just gone to a meditation retreat in Hawaii with one of the greatest Zen teachers he's probably the greatest Zen teacher that I have met, named Robert Aitken. Robert Aitken was working as just an ordinary civilian on Guam. And when the Japanese invaded in 1941, he was taken prisoner and taken to, he was like a prisoner of war as a civilian in Japan. And he got into contact with a professor of English literature named R.H. Blythe, who wrote books about Zen and English literature. And Robert Aitken became interested in Zen and later became a great teacher. So at the end of this 2001 meditation retreat, he said afterwards, let's go and have a separate discussion. And he said at that time that we are heading into a very, very difficult situation. There's something radical has changed because of those 9/11 attacks. So those 9/11 attacks were a major flag for those of us who are interested in civil liberties and interested in political and in democracy. And now I think that with this latest fiasco going on with Iran, it's going to get a lot tighter, unfortunately. And that's just something I think we need to be aware of. And it all starts, with my opinion, it all starts with consciousness. When you become aware of the tension in your body, you can learn to relax it. If you come in contact with very fixed ideas in your mind, you can look at them and saying, oh, this is a fixed idea. Is there any other alternative way to think about something? So the point of my work is to help you break through that kind of tension or closed-mindedness that is keeping us in essentially a mental prison. So that's it. And, please support my channel with a like or a share, or if you'd like to contribute, that would be great. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again for listening.